Hi everybody, today I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about treaties and agreements between Indigenous people and governments. As we know, other countries have long had treaties in place with Indigenous people. In Australia, however, there has been no such agreement with Indigenous people and the colonisers. Slow progress has been made through land rights and native title. However, as I said, this has been a long, slow process. Agreements between Indigenous people and colonisers provides Indigenous people with recognition, inclusion and a framework to pursue benchmarks in employment, health, education and cultural maintenance, for example. The extent of these agreements can vary. For example, in Canada they have incorporated financial compensation. Agreements between small Indigenous groups and governments are easier to negotiate and are also easier to implement and manage. They are also easier to work through than things such as national treaties. As I have said in weeks 1 and 2, it is very easy, for two different groups to have two different views on a particular term, and this can result in conflict between the two groups. And we see this with the term treaty. Okay, so I'll return to this a little later. I just want to spend a few minutes now talking about the Torres Strait. Since the Mabo decision in 1992, native title has resulted in 27 native title determinations in the Torres Strait. This is part of 50 across Australia, moreover. According to the Native Title Act, the Torres Strait Regional Authority is the body that represents native title in the Torres Strait. The Torres Strait Regional Authority is a statutory authority, similar to the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, that consists of two parts: an elected board and an administrative section. Now, the administrative section of the authority are public servants. The board consists of 15 Indigenous people who are elected by Indigenous people living in the Torres Strait. These elected people then sit on a board as regional councillors. Throughout the early history of contact between Indigenous people and colonisers around the world, agreements between the two groups had typically resulted in the colonised interests always coming first. This was even the case when the British Home Office gave clear orders to foster friendly relationships with Indigenous people. Indigenous people around the world have long had and have long been in relationships with people with more power, and as a result they have had to develop good negotiation skills and good political nous. Although we have seen Indigenous people begin to make progress over the last few decades, there is still a long way to go in areas such as land and natural resource management. The easiest and most practical and cost-effective way to resolve these issues and future issues is through negotiation and agreement making. Agreement making has become a manageable way for Indigenous people to get a foot in the door and make inroads in areas such as environmental management, cultural management, education and employment. As I've said, terminology can often cause conflict and dispute between two groups. The term agreement, when it comes to Indigenous people and Western institutions, could have a range of meanings. It could be used in an informal sense, such as an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, or it could have legal connotations such as treaties. The problems and disadvantages that Indigenous people around the world have suffered as a result of colonisation is far-ranging, and there can be no miracle solution to these problems. Agreement making, however, can provide a solid foundation. However, Western governments around the world have seen agreements with Indigenous people as opportunities to forget Indigenous history and the influence colonisation has had on their disadvantage. Agreement making provides Indigenous people with the opportunity to have established perspectives rather than have their views drowned out by a lack of power. In Australia, it has only been since 1992 that Indigenous occupation of the land prior to colonisation has legally been recognised. Agreements between Indigenous groups and private companies, such as mining companies, can result in employment opportunities for Indigenous people and long-term use of land by mining companies. Now, some of the important themes in Indigenous government agreements include a lack of capacity, relationship building, and negotiation strategies, and I'm going to discuss these a little bit now. Now, leadership and capacity building. Well, capacity building is crucial in agreements Indigenous people make with governments. This involves developing Indigenous people's ability to engage in Western-style negotiations with government and to understand financial arrangements. This is also crucial in the area of leadership, as for Indigenous leaders to emerge in Indigenous communities, they will need to be familiar with these Western processes. Relationship building. Well, it is crucial as part of the capacity building process that Indigenous people are informed of the positives of developing positive relationships with governments and the private sector. Now, what I mean by capacity building is, for example, if we as a group, that's me and you guys, have an idea that could be used by millions of people, we need the capacity to know what to do with that idea. Okay, so that's what I mean by capacity building. Negotiation strategies. Well, it is in the interest of Indigenous people that they also develop negotiation skills. This needs to include the ability to do things such as identify and negotiate practical outcomes that take into consideration changes in government and financial sustainability. Now I want to spend a few minutes just talking about a treaty. Okay, so this will just be brief. In Australia, when Indigenous people talk about a treaty, they are talking about something that will encapsulate their struggles for recognition and end their struggles in areas such as land rights, education, health and housing. They see a treaty as an ultimate end to the inequalities they have experienced and continue to experience, as a document that commits governments to end this disadvantage. Even if the concept of a treaty may not be achievable in the short term, the concept of a treaty can engage Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people and governments in discussions in which other objectives can surface and be met. It also provides Indigenous people with an opportunity to share their concerns directly with government. And all of this can influence people and governments to think more deeply and more strategically about a range of important long-term issues. A treaty would provide Indigenous people and governments with a framework to establish short and long-term targets and to allocate dedicated funding to these targets. The important thing about a treaty may not be how things get done, but may be allowing for things to get done. And this could include, for example, spelling out clearly what land and sea rights Indigenous people have, and to what extent they control these rights. What can they do with them? So can they develop economic ventures on them? The national inroads a treaty can make is in the area of education. For example, curriculum has been about promoting Western histories and developing white Australian identities. A treaty could ensure that Indigenous perspectives are also a practical way to engage Indigenous people in the education system, the teaching of those perspectives and histories, I mean. In Australia, a treaty has been seen by Indigenous people as a way for compensating Indigenous people for the land and natural resources that were taken from them without their consent. In Australia, the federal government opposed the notion of a treaty on the basis that they will lose power. Its argument was that its job is to govern for all Australians, including Indigenous Australians. So, a starting point for Indigenous Australians may well be the recognition that they need to accept the Australian government's position on this at the moment and work from there. To some Indigenous people, this may be enough to deter them from getting involved further. Others may see this as an opportunity to at least develop some sort of positives. Now, when calls for a treaty were ignored by governments, some Indigenous people began calling on changes to the Australian Constitution to include a special place for Indigenous Australians. At the moment, the Labor government has suggested, the federal Labor government, that this referendum will go before the Australian people. For some Indigenous people, it's important to point out that a treaty may not be high on their priorities. They may see it as a distraction, a smokescreen from getting on with improving health, education, housing, for example. Others may see the whole treaty thing as governments doing what they should be, and others may argue that a treaty is not only about ensuring that Indigenous people receive the same citizenship rights as other Australians, to compensate for the fact that they did surrender their land, that they did not surrender their land and natural resources and were not compensated when their land and natural resources were taken from them. So what I'm saying there is that some people may not see the treaty, some Indigenous people may not see the treaty as a priority because government should be providing service to Indigenous people anyway. Others may see it as an opportunity to be compensated for not surrendering their land and natural resources. Others still may argue that Indigenous people are not ready for a treaty, that there is still much capacity building needed before Indigenous people can really sit down and negotiate. Others still may argue that this lack of capacity is exactly why a treaty is needed, to ensure that such shortfalls in capacity are properly addressed. In Australia, non-Indigenous Australians and organisations have also supported the notion of a treaty between the government and Indigenous people. For example, the Australian Medical Association support it because it will finally mean that Indigenous people will improve their well-being, and because it will finally mean that they will have an adequate amount of money allocated to their health care. Look, people talk about a treaty all the time. as if it is something that is simple and we can just reach out and grab it. Well, that's not the case. What is a treaty? What goes in the treaty? Who determines this and why? Again, does somebody living in Queensland determine what is in a treaty and determine that on behalf of all Aboriginal people? To some people living in coastal areas, protection of marine life might be important. To people living in remote areas, protection of their language might be important. To people living in urban areas, other things may be important. So the thing about a treaty is that the issue of representation will surface its ugly head again, because what goes in the treaty and who determines this? Okay, so have a little bit of a think about this, do the readings and complete the required activities, and feel free to share your thoughts with us on LearnLine.